Grayoso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 219, Language Imperialism. Last time we introduced you to the Blue Books, and which were the final publication from the Royal Commission on Education in Wales in 1847. We're going to spend more time in this episode talking in detail about the documents themselves and why they were so critical to Welsh history. As well, we're going to talk in greater length about education in Wales before 1847 and kind of what drove some of this review and why there was this need or belief of a need to make changes. If you were pro-Welsh language and culture, this is going to be a topic where you will view this from a lens of a bunch of documents written from a perspective which presents Wales on the negative and presents specifically the Welsh language in the negative, and as such are called by some nationalists the traitorous documents that tried to destroy Wales as a country. And if I'm being honest, I wouldn't disagree with that argument. Victorian Britain was all about Britain as an empire, wrapped in one banner of an ever-expanding colonial domain that outshone any before it. At its height, it was likely the biggest empire in history, spanning every continent that had been explored to that point, and in this period seemed to never be ending in how it ruled the waves. It did not love messy rebellions, independence, or complicated ideas around who were and were not really British. The home islands were to be the center of a wheel where all the bounty of the colonial control radiated, and so it could not have difference. If we are teaching the fill-in racist named here from the colonies to be like us, speak like us, and act like us, then there needs to be a definitive idea over who and what us is, and none of it can have nuance. The colonies became, in effect, a driving force in controlling the image of Britain under the Queen, representing order and quintessential Britishness. So it comes as no surprise that the idea behind Britishness, in quotes, was led by English language upper classes. Highland Scots, Irish, Gaelic, Cymry, and other languages like this, such as Manx and Cornish, were holdovers from a bygone age to be left back there like Latin or Greek, to be studied, maybe, but not honored or accepted. It became the image of ill education and, worse yet, maybe, republicanism and revolution. So what lies behind the issues with education in Wales? If you examine closely enough, you can see it is fairly obvious. Education has been done since the Middle Ages by the clergy, while some of the private agencies that we'll discuss start to become more effective. They had a very small role and generally were more elite in nature, although not all of them were. That meant most poor people were not able to access these options. In comparison, however, medicine had grown better and food sources started to become more reliable and produce at larger and larger intensities, which then allowed for a rapid pace of population expansion coupled with an inward migration from England and other parts of rural Wales drove a more industrial and larger population center in the country. And it also created bigger and more successful families. Life expectancy was slowly growing through the 19th century and would explode after the end of World War I, but the reality was simply that more children were living into adulthood. This created more demand for education, created even more mouths to feed for the poor. It also created more political desire to match the agenda of trying to protect children as more and more people in the society started to realize that just having children working at the same level of an adult was both dangerous and unproductive and caused massive fundamental problems to society. So there was a thought process that would slowly grow that children needed to be more educated, they needed to be treated as children and less as mini adults, something which did not really exist to this level before this. It will be the Victorian age that actually drives the concept of childhood being a childhood, and this concept of children from the age of 6 to 12 being separate from an adult and separate from dealing with adult problems or adult issues, having to raise money for the family. All of these things will start to slowly diverge because of this, and it's one of the reasons why you see such change as we enter into the 20th century on the expectations and what a child is and does for its family. This, of course, also creates higher demand for education, and also because there are more people to feed, it makes it harder for poor people to fund that education. And also, many religious groups see a key in spreading the word of God into literacy, and so that's why so many religious organizations at the time approved of and started fostering education at many different levels. And we've talked about how specifically in the 1700s there was a movement to drive literacy forward in Wales, something that was actually quite successful, much to the lament, I think, to some degree, for the British government, who were driving an English idea and an English system. The British school system, as it existed in the days before the Blue Book in Wales, was a mixed bag, as I mentioned. In part, there were the rotating and rolling teachers that were wandering through the 1700s, teaching on sort of a catch-as-catch-can basis. But as we roll into the 1800s, more formal education centers are existing and being established. People are paying for schools to be located into Wales, pretty much in some areas for the first time ever. It will eventually lead to more advanced schools and eventually the first university later in this century. Prior to 1814, Joseph Lancaster would come into the situation. He would be a leader of what was called the British school system. Lancaster was a Quaker who saw for a need for a school system that was agnostic of any specific Christian religion, but still taught from the Bible. It was a non-sectarian education system founded on British Christian values, to use a modern term, to teach children. And it would establish what was called the British Foreign School Society in 1814, but before that, Lancaster would spread his ideas into South Wales, in Swansea, Neath, Cardiff, and Carmarthen. He would be very successful in setting up a society in Swansea for educating the poor, and these poor children could only attend if their parents could not afford any other school system. So there was a barrier to it, but it was an upper barrier instead of a lower barrier, which is an interesting qualification. They would be taught reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, as well as morals, and these were usually based off of the biblical stories. These schools were then set up over time across South Wales, and to some success, but keep in mind that they taught children, largely boys, from ages 6 to 12, many of whom only went till about 10 years old, and they were, for the most part, English language only, because that was where the teachers gained their training, if they had any, and it was largely where their supplies would originate, if they had any of those. If it was to be considered in that point a professional school, that's probably as close as you were getting. Most Welsh language-based Sunday schools were unable to offer that kind of level of education, and in a time when child labor was still the normal situation for people, education was taught when it could be, and those who could gain access to it. So when, as mentioned in the last episode, the report talks about Welsh language literacy being for the most part taught at Sunday school for a couple of hours only on Sunday, there's an obvious reason for that. You can't afford to have your child not making money and bringing in income to contribute to the family. Then you can't afford to have them on days where they should be working at school. which is part of the issue. Keep in mind that in this era, schooling is usually a 6-day-a-week affair. It is not, and nor has it traditionally been something that was taught on a weekday basis, except for the upper classes. So most children, if they got any education, it was done on a Sunday, which was the 1 day a week set aside for non-labor, and it was at Sunday school or a religious school system where they took a couple of hours and basically taught. Along with that, they were generally taught not by educated and trained teachers, but by local people who might have been seen as the most literate or the most able, as well as some of the schools themselves were poorly kept places because the nonconformists who controlled them generally didn't have the funding, as they were dependent on local funding from local parishioners who themselves were largely poorer class people. So you didn't have the same level of education, and then you didn't have the same level of accommodation. Typically these are either in the churches themselves or in the functional buildings that acted like churches, and in some cases just small rental places in them, maybe even in a barn. So by comparison to a properly built and constructed school, you're talking about a very different situation. Along with all of this just kind of heaped on it so much more perceptions of the Welsh language being the language of the past and the language of the poor, which presented it in a way that would be marked as not as useful or as effective or good as the English language. In August of 1833, the first government grants started to flow to the Anglican National Society and the non-denominational British Society to help fund education, none of which went to the struggling Sunday schools who were teaching the majority of the students. And even that funding that they got was pitifully small in Wales, because frequently these organizations had to meet a certain level of contribution in order to qualify for government grants, and they didn't because they didn't have wealthy enough parishioners to help with the funding. It's kind of ironic, but that was one of the things that would go on. And when you look at the Sunday schools, they were actually teaching from about double as many, and in some cases triple as many, as the local English language schools were teaching. So they were much more attended. They were, as I say, being taught in the local language, and importantly, were contributing to the education of children, but not receiving any help from the government. Funding would change, at least for the English language schools, in 1839, as it would be increased, as many were starting to see that the contributions of larger funding to help build schools and hire teachers was critical to educating youth. And now across Wales, there were these two different societies trying to make a difference in the education of the poor. As I said earlier, the nonconformist British societies and the Anglican National Society. The National Society was focused much more heavily on moral education and in creating a good, God-fearing member of society. Discipline was harsh, even by the most severe of today's version, or even what we might remember from, say, the 50s. And while there was basic instruction on reading, writing, and arithmetic, it was very rudimentary and mostly based around biblical study and religious-focused readings, such as the Lord's Prayer or catechisms, things like that. Neither school system relied on supplies and books outside of the Bible, and as they were very much in short supply and expensive, libraries were generally non-existent at this point, so you had very few locations that you could use to gain this funding or this help. As these two systems spread out across Wales through the 1840s, they were attempting to reach as many students as they could from east to west and north to south. Part of the reason for this push was because over the 1830s, political classes had become convinced that the Welsh poor were continually creating trouble and they needed to deal with it in some form or fashion. The final key to the puzzle of English language education was the works schools. These were usually set up around ownerships of various industrial centers, such as ironworks or mechanical or slate schools, or there were copper schools. They were all effectively looking much more around the industry and around training people on various parts of it. So while they had a different setup, they were generally much more agnostic, for example, focusing on literacy, math education, and around things like day-to-day life, style stuff, training on chemicals, each of the different industries, of course, focusing on an industrial part, as well as, to some degree, some religious parts. But they weren't in the same manner or fashion as, say, the national school or the British school system, which were very much focused around religious education. And some cases, at least some small cases, they were even taught in the medium of Welsh, unlike a lot of the other school systems. But the reality of it was, this was not necessarily very common. Industrial schools, however, were charged usually from wages of the employees, be they the children who were in these schools or the actual parents, which meant that in some cases the parents weren't terribly happy about them. Think of having your child away from earning money for half a day and then the other half of the day basically paying for the education. You can kind of get the sense as to why they may not be very thrilled with it. While it was more wide-ranging than some of the religious schools, it still would have problematic aspects to it. This was no longer the land of princes and kings. It was now the backward troublemaker, not unlike in the days and language of King Edward. Now, instead of physical conquest, it needed to be partnered with a cultural one. And it was in this mindset that we delve into what are now known as the Blue Books, and from that angle they are presented to us. In 1846, the role of the Welsh language in education was extensively investigated by a commission set up to inquire into the state of the education in Wales and, quote, especially into the means afforded to the labouring classes for obtaining a knowledge of the English language, end quote. The aim was then pretty clear. The inquiry was instituted following a speech by William Williams, the MP for Coventry, as mentioned last time, but as I thought when I mentioned it, he was a native of Llanpwsant in Carmarthenshire who had moved to England, seemingly thought to bring Wales into the new cultural paradigm. His call created a commission which consisted of 3 young barristers, English and Anglican specifically, and because of that, they were in categories that completely controlled their thought process. The idea that English was the proper language and that Anglicanism was the proper religious standpoint certainly colored a lot of their commentary, and they set about to gather vast amounts of information and to create a report which was 1,252 pages long and was published on April 1st, 1847. To quote historian Janet Davies, quote, "The language of the Commissioner's report has been described as colonial prejudice at its most blatant. The report drew a dark picture of Welsh society and emphasized the vast gulf that separated the almost totally English-speaking wealthier classes from the largely Mongolot Welsh poorer classes." End quote. They viewed Welsh language schools as woefully incapable of meeting the needs of the students. They viewed them in comparison to English Anglican schools, which they perceived as being better funded and better surveyed, thus better schools, which of course is not accurate necessarily. Something that would again and again show this issue of a lack of understanding of the Welsh culture and an idea that 1 or 2 examples covered the entire thing, that a poor school here was equivalent to a school that might be well funded or much better educated, and so thus they got tarred with the same brush, to use that kind of example. Instead of seeing the problem as being created by a lack of support or funding for the poorer schools, these Sunday schools, the Commission took the view that it was the language that was at fault. They were backed by Anglican clergy and the upper class, who also agreed and long since had abandoned Welsh as a language, a process that started about the time Henry Tudor became Henry VII. They saw it as a massive drawback, and they quoted a large number of letters, mostly from these same Anglican clergymen, who insisted that the moral and material conditions of the Welsh could not be improved without a general introduction of the English language. For many of the Welsh upper class of society, the reality for them was that being Welsh had proved to be a disadvantage, and thus they perceived the entire cultural standing based on the financial advantages they would receive if people did no longer speak Welsh or really culturally be Welsh compared to their English or so-called British cousins. This whole perception drove so much of their attitude. Quoting Janet Davis again, quote, "For some Welsh leaders, evidence of English contempt was to goad to action, and by mid-century, men like Michael D. Jones were giving voice to a new linguistic nationalism. To others of those leaders, perhaps the majority, the removal of the English contempt could only be ensured by making the Welsh as similar to the English as possible." End quote. When you dive into the report, you find some startling descriptions of the Welsh people, from rustics to basically poor bumpkins who were unable to separate education into different male and female lessons, who were led to accusations that this combination of males and females into the same classroom would lead them to sin by some of these same Anglican clergy, a wholly unfounded opinion, but certainly one that fits the bill of what to expect from the Welsh from an English perspective. The report's general focus was fairly clear from the opening words. There was no sense of investigating the use of Welsh, whether in speech or in written word. Education in Welsh was considered a waste of time, and likely part of why the Welsh people were so rebellious. It was also the study of an education in the English language, especially, while the rest of the system was added as a secondary concern. In other words, the subject matter at hand was English and not religious education or arithmetic or any other part of education, at least not in the majority. That was more of a secondary concern. And make no mistake, from the outset, there was no bone tossed to respecting the Welsh language or its culture. In one report, it in fact blamed it for the problems. Quoting from the record in Carmarthenshire, quote, "My district exhibits the phenomenon of a particular language isolating the mass from the upper portions of society. And, as a further phenomenon, it exhibits this mass engaged upon the most opposite occupations at the point not very distant from each other, being on one side rude, primitive agriculturalists living poorly and thinly scattered, and on the other smelters, miners, wantoning in plenty and congregated in the densest accumulations." So to this report, effectively, both the industrial and the rural were problematic. To this English administrator, the fact that both sides of the poor, either agricultural poor or industrial poor laborers, were somehow not striving to get out of their circumstance was peculiar. This was seen as an issue with the language. Cymru, to this man, was a language of the old-fashioned agriculture, of theology and simple rustic life, while all the world about him was English. The only time we hear from the poor Welsh people who are not able to speak English, in the author's view, is when they are demonstrating, holding strikes, or some sort of violence occurs, through Chartism and Rebeccaism on religious revival, bringing them to the fore through the media. It is paternalistically seen as a cry for help from a backward people. You can see the thought being built here. Learning English meant that you were able to advance into society, that you were able to move up the ladder of social development. And without it, you could never amount to anything. The only people you could communicate with were other people who spoke this same rustic, quotes, language. Thus, to someone from the British Empire, this worldview only made sense. Why would you speak Welsh, Gaelic, Punjabi, Urdu, Cantonese, Tero, Cree, or Swahili when you could speak the language of business and economy, English? This logic would drive a great deal of the thinking over the next 100 to 150 years, and to be honest, it drove the Victorian domination of English around the world before American culture swept it in even greater numbers through movies and television to push this built-in advantage created by the imperialists. In fact, one could argue that Hollywood's larger achievement in spreading English stood on the backs of good old colonialism. Across the empire, legislation forced English into many classrooms, official correspondence, and other ways throughout the cultures of the empire. In the same ways, the clearing of the Highlands, the Irish National Commission on Education in 1831, and the Welsh Blue Books set the stage for the ancient languages of the British Islands to be set aside for the language of the ruling class, English, and set the tone that would later happen in places like India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, and eventually great swaths of Africa, because what they spread at home, they wanted to spread abroad. That was the reason for these research and for these various ideas and what they wanted to do. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You could also reach out to me on Twitter, also known as X, at Welsh History Pod. You can also reach me on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Come along, please comment, add your thoughts. We're also found on YouTube at youtube.com/at Welsh History Podcast. And you can find us on Patreon, where if you would feel so inclined, you can help us with our research that we are doing into these subjects and building on the research that we do so frequently, or that I do so frequently on these topics, which are so necessary, at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Have yourselves an awesome day. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.